And with us to discuss more on all of this is NBC News White House correspondent Yamiche Alcindor, NBC international reporter Matt Bodner. Also with us, former Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman and former CIA Chief of Operations in Europe and Eurasia, Mark Polymeropoulos. He's also an MSNBC national security and intel analyst. Yamiche, who's on this call and what's the White House's goal?
Well, there are a number of different calls here. And what the White House says that the president is doing is essentially being in listening mode. He wants to hear from President Zelensky and European leaders ahead of this historic summit with Vladimir Putin in Alaska, where the White House also says he's going to be in listening mode because, of course, it's going to be one state leader that is, of course, in a conflict with another country. I want to read to you part of who's going to be on these calls. The first call is Ukrainian President Zelensky. Then you have the German Chancellor, European leaders, and European Union representatives. Then you have a second call. That's going to be, again, Zelensky. Then you're going to have President Trump, Vice President Vance, as well as the NATO Secretary General, again, representing European interests. And then there's a third call with Zelensky and a coalition of willing EU governments, UK and Canada. So what you have here is a full day of sort of ramp up to this summit with all of these leaders wanting to be in the ear of President Trump, because I can't underscore enough that this was right now a bilateral meeting between President Trump and President Putin. And President Zelensky very much wants to be at that table. European leaders also want to be at that table. But for right now, the president says he wants to look Vladimir Putin in the eye and see if he's really interested in a peace deal, Anna.
Matt, what are Zelensky and European leaders hoping to accomplish today in this phone call? Is this a final chance to persuade President Trump on certain things before he meets with Putin?
Well, it certainly looks that way, Anna, at least in terms of a big sort of combined effort. So what we're seeing today, I would characterize as a full court press by the Western alliance to ensure that the interests of Europe and Ukraine are protected at this summit on Friday. It's also a bid to ensure that Trump stays on side. There's a lot of obvious concern that Trump might walk right into a Russian trap and try to sign Ukraine and Europe up for a deal that they can't or simply won't accept. And Russia today has made it clear that they're not going to offer any concessions on Friday, or at least that's the message they're sending before the summit. It's not necessarily clear what that means for Trump's talking point about land swaps, but the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Maria Zakharova, reiterated that Russia still wants total control of all 4 of the Ukrainian regions that they've occupied during this war. Quoting from her now, she said, quote, "The territorial structure of the Russian Federation is enshrined in the constitution of our country. That says it all. Therefore, as for the goals of the Russian delegation, they are dictated by the national interests." This is a reference to the 5 Ukrainian regions that Russia has annexed since 2014. That includes Crimea, but we are mostly talking about Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, which Russia does not actually fully control. So they are asking for more than they've seized on the battlefield. Now, of course, we'll see if Putin actually sticks to that on Friday. But, you know, we've been hearing that consistently from the Kremlin throughout the entire war. Anna?
And Wendy, as we know, the president's expected to be in this virtual meeting as we speak. Who do you think President Trump is most likely listening to today? Who has the best chance of getting through to him ahead of this meeting with Putin?
Well, I think President Trump believes that, as he has often said, his best advisor is himself. And so I think he will listen today, and he will certainly hear that both Zelensky and the European leaders and the UK and Canada believe that there should be a ceasefire first, and then a discussion of whether there's a deal. And President Zelensky has said time and time again, as have we as a U.S. government, no decision about Ukraine without Ukraine, because we're talking about a sovereign country, which was the whole issue at the beginning when Russia invaded illegally and horrifically a sovereign country and tried to take territory. As Matt pointed out, they don't control the territory that they want. And there is great concern because there are lots of Ukrainians, of course, who live in these parts of Ukraine. And what will any land swap mean for their future, for their lives? What are all the other issues that need to be decided? So I know President Trump has wisely lowered expectations here, that this is now just going to be a listening session, but it's not clear what that means. And Zelensky and the Europeans are quite concerned that he will make decisions and then put the onus on Zelensky to say no, which would put Zelensky in a very bad position.
Mark, is Putin likely paying attention to today's talks and any readout that comes from them? Is he hoping to see some daylight between Trump and these European leaders?
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, Putin has already won in the sense that he has a bilateral meeting just with the president of the United States in Alaska, of course, which is odd in and of itself. Everyone was looking back to the 1867 Alaska Purchase to talk about the relevance, and Russian ultranationalists are kind of celebrating this. But Putin is looking at this as an ability to use his old kind of wily ways as a former intelligence officer to perhaps get Trump to say something that's going to drive a wedge with Zelensky. Already there was concern because in the press conferences of the last couple of days, Trump has kind of turned a bit on Zelensky. There was a period of time which I think a lot of us thought was actually a very good development in which Trump got tougher on Putin. So the real question is who's going to show up, and Putin is going to try to ensure that the tough on Russia Trump is not going to be the one when they have an inevitable press conference after the summit. And they start talking about any kind of future deals. And so I think Putin really is in the driver's seat here. He knows that. He knows probably how to manipulate Trump. And I hope the right Trump shows up, the one who has been tougher on Putin, right, rather than one who from his first administration surely had some disdain for the Ukrainians.
We have seen some shifting narratives from Trump specifically, Matt, when it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to Putin and Russia. What is the overall relationship like between Trump and his European counterparts at this point, considering the tension not just on NATO and Ukraine, but also the economic friction from all of his tariffs?
Well, there's been sort of a lot of ups and downs on this one. He was talking quite positively about these leaders today. But, as we've been talking about the past few days, Europe is walking a tightrope, a bit of a tightrope with Trump overall. Like almost everyone else, they've had to maneuver trade threats. And, the EU did manage to hash out a deal with Trump recently, which did cap the U.S. tariff on EU imports at 15%. There's still some sectors where that number might go up or down. That process is still ongoing. But sort of hanging over Europe the whole time, there's this big dilemma is that they remain very much dependent on the United States from a security and military standpoint, particularly with the Ukraine situation. There has been progress, notably over the past few months with Trump on these points, again, particularly with Ukraine, in which, recently we saw European members of NATO agree that they'll purchase hardware from the United States to give to Ukraine. There's this concerted effort by the European states to ramp up their own domestic arms manufacturing, but they are still in a bind and to a large extent at the mercy of Trump on these issues. Anna?
Yamiche, we're learning some new details about the location of Friday's Trump-Putin meeting, and Trump already complaining about how it's being covered this morning. What do we know?
Well, it's very interesting. We now know that this summit, this historic summit, is going to be at a military base in Alaska. That, in some ways, really speaks to just how quickly this all came together. A military base is a sort of easy choice if you're looking for a secure location that already has protocols in place. We've seen at the last summit, which I attended in Helsinki, it was not at a military base. It was at a sort of civilian, nice-looking sort of resort-style setting. We know that the president likes to be able to be around sort of opulence. But in this case, what you're going to see is just really a military base. And then again, just speaks to how quickly this all came together. The other thing is that the president has been posting online, complaining about the coverage, something that we know the president does often. He wrote just in the last few minutes, very unfair media is at work on my meeting with Putin, constantly quoting fired losers and really dumb people like John Bolton, who just said, even though the meeting is on American soil, Putin has already won. What's that all about? We are winning on everything. So that's the president really complaining about the coverage. What we do know, of course, is that there really is a concern that the president sitting down with Vladimir Putin might be seen as a sort of reward to Putin after he has now invaded Ukraine's sovereign territory twice. That being said, we'll just have to see what comes from the summit and whether or not the president strikes that sort of more combative tone or if he strikes the tone that he struck in Helsinki. I was in the room when he had that press conference, and he was really more demure. And of course, he really infamously took the side of Vladimir Putin when he was asked about whether or not Russia had interfered in the 2016 election. So it's going to be very interesting to see how President Trump reacts when he's in the room with Putin, and if there is a press conference, sort of where he goes and how he sort of, whether or not he at all concedes anything to Vladimir Putin in that press conference.
Wendy, does an American military base make sense for this? Is it the right venue?
Well, I think Yamiche made an important point. How do you put something together this fast and ensure you have a secure location? I think that President Trump should stop tweeting. Of course, he won't, because it just makes Putin feel he's even more in the driver's seat, because President Trump looks like he is reacting to commentary that, of course, will happen today. Putin asked for this meeting. The president was flattered by that. I've been in a meeting with former Secretary of State John Kerry in Sochi with Putin for 4 hours. Putin is smart. Those KGB trained instincts are there. He did that meeting without a single note. He knows what he's doing. He's on top of his game. He is clear. In his mind, Ukraine belongs to Russia and the Russian Federation. I don't see him moving back from that unless we are giving weapons. We are helping Ukraine succeed. They can target military bases and other assets inside of Russia. And let's remember, just recently we saw that, in fact, Russia probably has hacked some federal court sealed records. Russia is being an adversary here. They are on the offense with the United States, as well as Ukraine, as well as Europe. And the president can be very tough. He needs to go into this meeting with that mindset, not complaining about the commentary that Putin is in charge of this meeting, because the reality is he asked for it. He knows what he's doing. And unless the president comes with clarity that he is listening, that he's not going to concede, Putin's going to win this round.